Cut.
My son, Grayson, opened his front door on Christmas Eve and said, "Dad, you and Mom need to leave. Now," like we were delivery men who showed up late. I stood there with a pie tin still warm in my hands, my knuckles stiff from the cold and from 60 years of pretending family means patience. His wife, Tessa, didn't even look up from her phone. She just tilted her chin toward our coats like she was directing traffic. I asked quietly, "What did we do?" And Grayson's eyes slid past mine as if my face was an inconvenience he could swipe away. He said, "You're upsetting the mood. We're hosting people. It's better if you're not here." For a second, I honestly thought he was joking, because who throws their parents out on Christmas like it's a policy update? Then he added, "You can figure it out. You always do." And that's when I felt the old familiar shame rise up, the kind that tastes like pennies and makes your ears burn. I looked at the living room behind him. Lights, laughter, a table set for everyone but us. And I realized we'd been invited only as long as we stayed useful and quiet. Subscribe, hit the like button, and tell me in the comments how old you are and where you're from. For you, it's just a small thing. But for me, it's the reason I keep telling these stories. My wife's hand found my elbow, not to hold me up, but to keep me from saying the wrong thing with a trembling voice. I tried to lift my overnight bag, and the zipper caught, because of course it did, my own suitcase choosing Christmas to stage a protest. Grayson watched me struggle and sighed, and that sigh hurt more than the words, like I was embarrassing him just by existing. I wanted to remind him of the nights I worked double shifts, the Christmas mornings I assembled toys with a flashlight and a tired grin, but my pride got stuck in my throat. So I simply nodded, the way older men do when they're bleeding inside and don't want the floor to see it. We walked down his steps into the cold, and the door clicked shut behind us with a finality that made the whole street feel louder. I stood by the curb, staring at the glow through his curtains, and thought, not for the first time, how strange it is to become a problem in the life you built. In my pocket, my phone buzzed with a bank notification I hadn't expected, and my wife squeezed my arm once, hard, like she was telling me, without words, that tonight wasn't going to end the way Grayson thought it would. We stood on the sidewalk while snow crept into my shoes, and I realized I'd worn the wrong boots, the ones with the tiny tear that always lets winter sneak in like a thief. I told myself to breathe slowly, because at my age, anger hits the chest before it hits the mouth, and I've learned to respect that order. I tried to call a cab, but my phone insisted on updating right then, the little wheel spinning like it had all the time in the world. My wife watched me wrestle with it and whispered, "It's okay," which somehow made me feel both steadier and smaller. Across the street, a neighbor's inflatable Santa collapsed face first in the snow, and I thought, well, at least I'm not the only one having a rough holiday. When the app finally loaded, the fare flashed a number that made me laugh out loud, a dry, startled sound, because it assumed we were desperate. I looked back at Grayson's house and felt a tight pull behind my eyes, not tears exactly, more like a pressure from years of swallowing disappointment. He used to ask me to check his homework at this very curb, used to stand on my shoes to feel taller, and now he couldn't spare us a chair. My wife suggested the bus, and I nodded, pretending it was practical and not symbolic, pretending we hadn't been pushed to the margins of our own family. We shuffled to the stop, and I missed the bench, sitting half on and half off like a man auditioning for a slapstick routine. She didn't laugh, but her smile softened the sting. While we waited, my phone buzzed again, and this time I read it carefully, my thumb steady despite the cold. The number stared back at me, familiar, solid, unbothered by Grayson's tone, and I felt something inside me straighten. I didn't say anything yet, because some truths need quiet before they're spoken. The bus lights appeared at the corner, slow and bright, and as it pulled in, I realized we weren't stranded at all. We were simply changing direction. I helped my wife aboard, paid the fare without looking at the driver, and felt a calm settle where humiliation had been trying to live. As the doors hissed shut, my phone vibrated with a message that made my jaw set, and I knew this night was about to test what Grayson believed he controlled. The bus smelled like wet coats and old vinyl, a sin I associate with patience learned the hard way. I fumbled with my balance when it lurched forward and nearly sat in a stranger's lap, muttering an apology that came out louder than intended, earning a few tired smiles. My wife took the window seat, and I stood for a moment longer than necessary, pretending my knees weren't negotiating terms with gravity. As we moved through streets glowing with decorations, I felt a strange mix of exile and relief, like being fired from a job you secretly hated. I replayed Grayson's words in my head, each one polished and sharp, and wondered when my son learned to talk like a manager instead of a boy. The injustice of it settled heavy, being told we were upsetting the mood, as if our age itself was a stain on his celebration. I remembered how we used to host Christmas with folding chairs and mismatched plates, how Grayson would complain there weren't enough presents and then fall asleep under the tree anyway. Now there were plenty of plates, plenty of laughter, just not a place for us. The bus hit a pothole, and my hat slid over my eyes, and I laughed despite myself, peeling it back like a curtain on a bad play. My wife squeezed my hand, and I could tell she was holding back more than words. She always does, saving them for when they matter most. My phone buzzed again, and I ignored it this time, because anger deserves its moment before it's managed. At the next stop, a couple climbed on arguing about directions, and I thought about how many times we'd argued quietly so Grayson wouldn't hear, how we'd chosen harmony over honesty for decades. That choice felt expensive now. I looked at my wife's profile reflected in the glass and saw resolve there, calm and unshakable, and it reminded me that we'd survived worse than a slammed door. When the bus finally slowed near downtown, I pulled the cord too early, jumping up with an enthusiasm my knees did not share, and nearly missed the stop altogether. The driver cleared his throat like a schoolteacher, and I thanked him with a nod that felt like an apology to the universe. We stepped off into the cold again, and as I reached for my phone, ready to stop pretending, I knew the unfairness of tonight wasn't finished showing its teeth. Downtown looked festive in a way that felt personal, like the city was celebrating without asking permission from anyone's children. I suggested a small cafe I remembered from years ago, then immediately walked past it twice because every storefront suddenly looked the same to me, lights blurring together like my reading glasses were playing tricks. We finally went inside, and I shook snow off my coat a little too aggressively, dusting a poor artificial pine by the door like it owed me money. The barista smiled politely, the kind of smile you give people who look like they might tell a long story, and I ordered coffee I didn't really want just to feel normal again. My wife sat across from me, hands folded, watching me with that quiet patience that has kept us married longer than most warranties last. I checked my phone at the table, and there it was again, the account summary, calm and steady, a number that had grown quietly while we grew older. I felt a bitter laugh crawl up my chest, because Grayson had always assumed we were scraping by, always offered advice with the confidence of someone who never paid our bills. He once suggested we downsize emotionally, whatever that means, as if dignity takes up square footage. The unfairness sharpened when I remembered how often we'd helped him, no questions asked, how we'd written checks without speeches because pride shouldn't need applause. I stirred my coffee too hard, splashing a drop onto the saucer, and apologized to no one in particular, a habit I'm trying to break. My wife leaned in and said softly, "This isn't about money." And she was right, which somehow made the money matter more. It wasn't a shield, it was proof we hadn't vanished, that our lives hadn't been reduced to a guest status. Around us, people laughed and argued and lived, and I felt the humiliation of earlier twist into something heavier, resolve mixed with grief. I thought about calling Grayson right then, about telling him he'd misjudged us badly, but I knew timing was everything, and this wasn't the moment. I paid the bill and accidentally left my gloves on the counter, realizing it only after we were halfway out the door, because apparently my brain had decided to multitask poorly. As we stepped back into the cold, my phone rang at last, not a text this time, but a call that made my stomach tighten, and I knew the story Grayson told himself about us was about to collide with the truth. The call was from Grayson, and I let it ring longer than necessary, long enough to remember how he used to call me 5 times in a row when he lost his keys. When I answered, his voice sounded tight, annoyed, like a man inconvenienced by consequences. He said, "Where did you go?" Not, "Are you okay?" And that difference landed hard in my chest. I told him we were fine, which was true in a way that surprised me, and he exhaled like I'd passed a basic test. He mentioned guests arriving, schedules shifting, the fragile ecosystem of his evening, and I realized we were still being managed, just remotely now. I listened, nodding out of habit even though he couldn't see me, and felt a quiet anger sharpen into something steadier. I told him we wouldn't be coming back tonight, and he paused, the silence filled with assumptions he'd been carrying for years. He asked where we were staying, and I said, "That's handled," which earned another sigh, heavier this time. I almost laughed, because the idea of me needing his approval at 60 felt absurd, like asking permission to breathe. My wife tapped my wrist gently, reminding me to keep my voice level, reminding me that dignity is louder than volume. Grayson finally said, "Dad, don't make this dramatic." And I thought about the irony of that request coming from someone who turned hospitality into exile. I told him goodnight, simple and clean, and ended the call before he could reorganize my feelings for me. My phone slipped from my hand right after, clattering onto the sidewalk, and I bent to pick it up with a grunt that sounded like an old engine starting. A passerby asked if I was okay, and I joked that gravity and I are renegotiating our relationship, which made him chuckle and move on. We walked a block in silence, the city humming around us, and I felt the humiliation of being dismissed finally burn off, leaving clarity behind. I knew Grayson believed we had nowhere to go, that pressure would fold us back into compliance. I also knew he'd underestimated the quiet work of a lifetime, the saving, the planning, the promises kept between my wife and me when no one was watching. I squeezed her hand and said, "It's time," and she nodded, eyes steady, already ahead of me. I pulled up the address I hadn't shared with anyone yet, and as we turned toward it, I understood that tonight wasn't about being thrown out. It was about choosing not to crawl back. The walk felt longer than it was, my legs complaining in a language I pretended not to understand, and I kept insisting the map was wrong when it was clearly my pride taking shortcuts. We passed a shop window where my reflection looked older than I felt, and I straightened my shoulders like posture could argue with time. My wife asked if I was sure about the address, and I said yes with confidence I borrowed from memory, then promptly led us one block too far. I laughed at myself, the kind of laugh that admits defeat without surrender, and turned us around like I meant to do it all along. The truth pressed in on me then. Being told to leave didn't just hurt, it rearranged something inside, knocked loose the careful balance between tolerance and self-respect. I thought about all the times I'd bitten my tongue to keep peace, all the holidays I'd smiled through small cuts disguised as jokes about our age. Tonight felt different. Tonight the cuts were visible, and somehow that made them easier to treat. My phone buzzed with a message from Tessa, short, polite, apologetic in the way that apologizes without changing anything, and I deleted it without reading twice. A gust of wind caught my hat again, and I chased it half a step before deciding I'd lived a full life without winning races against fabric. My wife teased me gently, and I told her the hat was testing my reflexes, which earned a soft laugh that steadied me more than any plan. We reached the building at last, its entrance quiet and unassuming, and I felt my chest tighten with a mix of nerves and relief. I fumbled the code on the keypad, hitting the wrong number because my fingers were cold and my head was full, and the door buzzed angrily like it was judging me. On the second try it opened, and I exhaled a breath I didn't know I'd been holding since Grayson's door closed. Inside, the hallway smelled clean and calm, and I realized how starved I'd been for both. I stopped there, keys warm in my palm, and understood this was the point where humiliation either finished me or hardened into resolve. I chose resolve, quietly, the way older men do when they finally stop asking permission. As we stepped inside, my phone lit up again with a notification that confirmed the decision I'd been carrying for years, and it made my hand stop shaking. The apartment lights came on with a soft click, and for a second I just stood there, letting my eyes adjust like I was entering a chapel instead of a temporary home. I set my bag down and immediately kicked it by accident, because even victory doesn't cure clumsiness, and muttered an apology to the furniture. My wife hung our coats neatly, a small ritual that always tells me she's grounding herself, turning chaos into order one hanger at a time. I walked to the window and looked out over the quiet street, thinking how strange it felt to be somewhere Grayson didn't know about. The silence wasn't empty. It was respectful, like it wasn't going to interrupt unless invited. I finally checked the notification I'd been avoiding, the one that confirmed what I'd planned years ago without ever saying out loud. The balance sat there, unchanged by tonight's drama, solid and indifferent to family politics, and I felt a deep, steady calm spread through my chest. We weren't rich in the loud way, but we were prepared, and preparation is a kind of dignity no one can evict. I sat down too quickly on the couch and had to rock forward once to stand again, chuckling at the reminder that resolve still comes with joints. My wife watched me with that knowing look and said, "Careful," not because I'd fall, but because she knows I push myself when my pride's awake. I told her, quietly, that we didn't need to explain anything to anyone tonight, and saying it felt like setting down a heavy box I'd been carrying for decades. We made tea using cups that didn't match, and I smiled at that, remembering all the times we'd been embarrassed by imperfections that never mattered. I thought about Grayson pacing his living room, checking his phone, telling himself a story where we were confused, lost, dependent. The injustice of it didn't sting anymore. It clarified. I realized that the real insult wasn't being asked to leave. It was being assumed to have nowhere to stand on our own. I looked at my wife and saw the same thought reflected back at me, steady and unafraid, and I knew the quiet anger inside me had finished changing shape. It wasn't about proving him wrong with numbers or addresses. It was about choosing ourselves without apology. I turned off my phone, something I rarely do, and felt lighter for it, like the night finally belonged to us. What Grayson didn't know was that this wasn't just a place to sleep. It was the beginning of a decision that would reach him soon, whether he was ready or not.
I watched my husband move through the apartment like a man relearning his own weight, careful but stubborn, and I recognized that look in his eyes, the one that comes after being underestimated. While he busied himself with tea he didn't need to stir so long, I sat down and let the silence settle into my bones. 60 years teaches you how to listen to quiet, how to hear what's finally stopped hurting. I thought about Grayson's face at the door, the way he'd spoken past me, not to me, as if motherhood had an expiration date. It wasn't the cold that made my hands shake earlier, it was the shock of realizing our son had already decided who we were allowed to be. I unpacked slowly, folding sweaters that didn't need folding, just to keep my thoughts from racing ahead of my heart. My husband knocked over the sugar bowl and froze like a child caught stealing, and I smiled despite myself, because some habits don't fade with dignity, they soften it. I told him it was fine, that floors forgive faster than people, and he laughed, the sound low and tired and real. Sitting there, I felt the injustice of the evening settle differently in me than it did in him. Where he felt insult, I felt erased. I remembered every holiday I planned around other people's preferences, every conversation I swallowed to keep the peace, every time I told myself this is what love looks like at our age. I checked my phone and saw messages from relatives, confused, curious, polite, and I realized how quickly stories grow when you're not there to tell your own. I didn't reply. For once, I wanted our silence to speak without being edited. I looked at my husband and knew he was holding back plans he'd been shaping for years, and I loved him for waiting until I was ready to hear them. When he sat down beside me, his knee cracked like a bad joke, and we both laughed, because even anger can't bully the body into behaving. I took his hand and said, "We didn't do anything wrong," and saying it out loud felt like reclaiming a small piece of land. He nodded, but I could tell he was already looking forward, past the hurt toward action. I wasn't there yet. I needed to grieve the son I thought I had before I could face the one who closed the door. I stood up, straightened my back, and felt something solid return to me, a sense of self that doesn't ask for permission. As I turned off the lamp, I understood that my part in this story was just beginning, and I wasn't planning to be quiet anymore. Morning came softly, the kind that doesn't ask permission, and I lay there listening to my husband breathe like the world hadn't rearranged itself overnight. I got up first, as usual, and nearly tripped over his shoes placed perfectly in the middle of the floor, a habit he swears is temporary but has survived decades. I made coffee too strong because my hands were still shaking, then added hot water and pretended that was always the plan. Sitting at the small table, I finally let myself feel the weight of what had happened, not the scene at the door, but the assumption behind it. Grayson didn't just ask us to leave. He decided we were fragile, dependent, finished. That realization hurt more than the cold ever could. My phone lit up with messages from family, some awkward, some carefully neutral, all circling the same question without asking it directly. I deleted most of them because explanations have a way of shrinking the truth. My husband shuffled in, squinting at the light, and asked if this place had morning rules, which made me smile despite myself. I told him the only rule was not to break anything before noon, and he promised nothing, which felt honest. As we ate toast that burned on one side and stayed pale on the other, I remembered all the times we'd been treated like background furniture, useful, sturdy, and easy to ignore. I thought about Grayson's wife, Tessa, and the way she looked through me like I was part of the decor. I wondered how often she'd rehearsed that moment, how easy it must have felt to edit us out. My husband reached for the sugar and knocked it over again, and we both stared at the mess like it was an omen before laughing quietly. The laughter didn't erase the anger, but it made room for it to breathe. I realized then that I wasn't interested in confrontation. I was interested in clarity. I stood at the window and looked out at a city that didn't know our names and didn't need to, and I felt oddly free. We had choices, real ones, and for the first time in years, no one was steering them for us. I turned back to my husband and said, "We need to stop waiting for permission," and he nodded without hesitation. What Grayson didn't understand yet was that his decision had stripped away our fear, and that kind of freedom doesn't stay quiet for long. By late morning, the phone started acting like it had a conscience, lighting up again and again as if persistence could rewrite the night before. I didn't answer at first. I wanted to hear my own thoughts without an audience. My husband tried to fix the toaster, convinced it was thinking about retirement, and managed to launch a slice across the counter like a weak protest, which broke the tension just enough for me to breathe. I sat beside him and realized something had shifted in me from hurt to resolve, a clean line I could finally see. Grayson's version of events was already circulating. I was sure of it, polished and convenient, with us recast as confused and emotional. That story had always worked before because I'd helped it along by staying silent. I opened one message from my sister-in-law, carefully worded, full of concern without responsibility, and I closed it again without replying. I wasn't angry at her. I was done being edited. My husband finally gave up on the toaster and bowed slightly to it, like a gentleman conceding a duel, and I laughed out loud, surprised by how good it felt. I told him I wanted to speak to Grayson later, not to argue, not to beg, but to state facts the way adults do when they're finished negotiating their worth. He listened without interrupting, which told me he trusted my timing, even if his instincts leaned toward action. I thought about the accounts, the plans we'd kept quiet because discretion felt safer than pride, and I felt a flicker of anger at myself for hiding our strength to make others comfortable. We hadn't saved all those years to be treated like temporary guests in our own family. When the phone rang again, I answered, and my voice surprised me with how steady it sounded. I said, "We're fine," before anyone could ask, and ended the call before sympathy turned into advice. My husband raised an eyebrow, impressed, and I told him I was done shrinking. I looked around the apartment, small, clean, ours for now, and understood that this wasn't a retreat, it was a pivot. The power Grayson thought he had over us was dissolving, not because of money, but because we'd stopped asking to belong. By the time noon light filled the room, I knew exactly what I was going to say to our son, and more importantly, what I would no longer accept in return. When I finally called Grayson, I made sure my hands were steady first, because I didn't want him to hear anything he could mistake for weakness. He answered on the third ring, his voice already prepared for defense, like he'd rehearsed being reasonable. I told him calmly that we were safe, comfortable, and not in need of instructions, and there was a pause long enough for me to picture his confusion. He tried to soften his tone, said things like, "It was just a misunderstanding, and you know how stressful hosting can be," as if stress turns parents into disposable items. I let him finish, because I wanted him to hear how small his excuses sounded when given space. Then I spoke, slowly, choosing words the way you choose stones to cross a river, deliberately, without rushing. I told him how it felt to stand in the cold holding food meant for family, how silence from his wife felt louder than shouting, how being told to leave changed something that couldn't simply be patched later. He interrupted once, and I stopped speaking immediately, letting the quiet do the work instead. My husband, listening nearby, tried to sit down and missed the chair by an inch, landing with a surprised grunt that almost made me laugh into the phone. Even then, life insisted on reminding us we were human. Grayson apologized, but it was the kind that comes wrapped in explanations, and I realized I wasn't interested in apologies that needed footnotes. I told him we wouldn't be coming back to smooth things over, not this week, not next, not until respect returned without being requested. He sounded startled by that, like someone hearing a boundary spoken aloud for the first time. I reminded him that love doesn't come with conditions and that age doesn't turn parents into furniture you move when guests arrive. My voice never rose, and I could tell that unsettled him more than anger would have. When the call ended, my hands were shaking not from fear, but from the release of years of swallowed words. My husband looked at me with something close to awe and asked if I wanted tea, immediately knocking the kettle lid onto the floor. I told him yes, because rituals matter when you're redefining yourself. Standing there together, I felt the confrontation settle into place, not explosive, but firm, like a door closing the right way this time. What Grayson didn't say, but I heard clearly, was that he was beginning to realize he'd misjudged who held the ground in this family, and that realization had only just started to sink in. The afternoon brought a different kind of quiet, the tense sort that waits to see who will blink first. I busied myself with practical things, laundry we barely had, a countertop already clean, because movement helps me think straight. My husband insisted on helping and promptly mixed the detergent with the dish soap, creating enough bubbles to suggest we were laundering a small parade. We stared at the foam together, then laughed, and that laughter steadied me more than any pep talk. It reminded me that even when control feels threatened, partnership isn't. The threat arrived not as shouting, but as paperwork. A message came through about the family trust, just a question, just to clarify, and I recognized the tactic immediately, confusion framed as concern. I felt the old pull to explain, to reassure, to make things easier for everyone else, and I let it pass like a wave I no longer needed to ride. We had built those structures carefully, line by line, not to hoard power, but to protect each other when voices got loud. I sat at the table, opened the documents, and read them slowly, savoring the calm authority of clear language. My husband hovered, offering opinions with the confidence of a man who once fixed a radio with duct tape and prayer. He pointed at a clause and said, "That one looks important," which was his way of saying he trusted me to handle the rest. I called our advisor and spoke plainly, no drama, no defensiveness, just facts placed where they belonged. When the call ended, the room felt lighter, like a window had been cracked open to let stale air out. I thought about what it would mean to lose access, to be sidelined by process instead of people, and my chest tightened. Not fear, clarity. If pressure came, we would meet it standing, not explaining ourselves from a chair we were asked to vacate. I looked at my husband and said, "They may test us," and he nodded, already rolling up his sleeves, then immediately asked where he'd put his glasses while they were still on his head. We laughed again, softer this time, and the laughter stitched my resolve tighter. As dusk edged in, my phone buzzed with another message that tried to sound reasonable while pushing the line, and I understood the next step would decide more than access. It would decide who we were allowed to be. By evening, the pressure finally stopped pretending to be polite. Grayson called again, this time without the careful tone, and I could hear strain beneath his words, like a floorboard starting to crack. He spoke about logistics, about family expectations, about how things were getting complicated, and I realized he was discovering what it feels like when control slips quietly out of reach. I let him talk while I watched my husband try to open a jar he'd already loosened, muttering at it like it had betrayed him personally, and the normalcy of that moment kept me anchored. When Grayson paused, waiting for reassurance, I didn't give it to him. I told him that what happened on Christmas wasn't a mistake, it was a decision, and decisions have consequences whether you announce them or not. He tried to reframe it, said we were overreacting, and I felt a brief flash of anger sharp enough to warm my hands. I reminded him, calmly, that being told to leave your child's home on a holiday doesn't age well into a misunderstanding. My husband finally got the jar open and held it up like a trophy, nearly dropping it in surprise, and I had to cover the phone to keep from laughing. Life, stubborn and unbothered, refused to pause for family drama. Grayson asked what we wanted, and that question told me everything. He still thought this was a negotiation. I said we wanted respect that didn't depend on convenience, and space to live without being managed like a liability. There was silence on the line, heavy and unfamiliar, and I understood he was recalculating his image of us in real time. He mentioned the trust again, more carefully now, and I told him any discussion about our affairs would happen on our terms, not in reaction to his discomfort. My voice didn't shake, and that steadiness felt like reclaiming my name. When the call ended, I sat back and felt the weight of it all settle, not crushing, but real. My husband sat beside me, asking if I'd won, and I told him this wasn't about winning, it was about not disappearing. He nodded, satisfied, then stood up too fast and had to pause, hands on his knees, grinning like a man caught by gravity mid-thought. I rested my head against his shoulder and felt something solid underneath the exhaustion. What neither of us said out loud was that the final step was already decided, and once taken, there would be no pretending things could go back to how they were. The next morning felt different, not lighter exactly, but settled, like furniture finally placed where it belongs. I woke before my husband and watched him sleep, mouth slightly open, glasses still on the nightstand where he always forgets them, and I felt an unexpected wave of gratitude. We weren't broken by what happened, we were clarified by it. I made breakfast and burned the first batch of eggs, because even emotional victories don't improve my timing, and when he wandered in and saw the pan, he said, "Good, I was hoping for something memorable." We laughed, and that laughter felt earned, not forced. We sat together and signed the last document we'd already discussed the night before, our names steady, our hands sure. It wasn't an act of revenge, it was an act of alignment, putting our future where our dignity already stood. I sent one message to Grayson, short, factual, calm, letting him know our decision was final and that we loved him, but we would not negotiate our worth. There was no immediate reply, and for the first time, I didn't fill the silence for him. I realized how often I'd mistaken responsibility for love, and how freeing it was to tell the difference. My husband offered to celebrate by making coffee and somehow managed to forget the mug under the machine, flooding the counter instead. We stood there watching it spill like a slow-motion comedy, and instead of sighing, we cleaned it together, side by side, exactly how we've always survived things. I thought about the years ahead, quiet ones, busy ones we haven't planned yet, and felt no fear about them. We had money, yes, but more importantly, we had choice, and that had been ours all along. Later that day, we stepped outside into the cold, hand in hand, not leaving anything behind this time. I didn't feel the need to look back or to check my phone for approval or regret. Our son's decision had tried to reduce us, but it had done the opposite. It had reminded us who we were when no one else was deciding for us. We hadn't raised our voices, and we hadn't begged to stay. We simply stood our ground. And in the quiet that followed, I understood something clearly and completely. They didn't break us. We stood together and we won.